after you roll out your slab, what you'll want to do is find a bowl that you can use to mold your clay over. This type of molding is called a hump mold. So you're putting it over the bump of something as opposed to putting it on the inside, which is called a slump mold. So hump, slump, but we'll be doing the hump mold for this one. And you can use a plate or a bowl. Try to find something that doesn't have a foot on it. A lot of bowls will have a little lip on the bottom. You can use those, but it can make it a little bit more difficult because then once you take it off, you'll have to fill in that little divot. But so if you find one that doesn't have that lip, that's ideal. So take the bowl, and so that it comes off once the clay is on it, and I'm trying to take it off so that it comes off easier, I use some saran wrap. Obviously, you just make sure that you have the right size. And so what I do is I have it on the back of it, and I take the corners and I just twist them together. I don't need to tie it. I just kind of twist it so that it's somewhat tight. You don't want it to be too tight. You want it to still have a little bit of give, but you don't want it to be all wrinkly. So just twist it, and then I kind of tuck them under and twist it again just to make sure that it stays and it doesn't come undone while I'm trying to do this. And the other side. So then I have these little bits over here, so I'm going to just kind of push them down so that I don't end up with all of that when I'm trying to put the clay flat down onto the bowl. So I just kind of pull them down. Once the clay is on there, it should, any little bits that are kind of wrinkly, it should smooth that out. On the inside of the bowl, you might have a little bit of that texture from the wrinkles in the saran wrap, but you can just smooth that out with a sponge once you take it off of the mold. And so you can do this just like on a flat surface. I'm going to be using my little wheel here. If you have a cake stand that spins, or even like a Lazy Susan or something, it makes it easier to make things symmetrical. And so you'll see that as I do it, I spin this so that it can be symmetrical all around. If you're doing like a weird wonky shape, like if you want the edges of the bowl to kind of have a bumpy edge, if that's the design that you're going for, this isn't as important, but for when you're trying to do something that is smooth around the outside, you can tell when there's little imperfections. So, and the other great thing about using these is that you can make bowls, many bowls, very quickly. I've made 6 bowls already. My goal is to make 9, so I have a set of 8 and 1 extra just in case anything happens to it. So you see it's pretty symmetrical. It's a little wonky, but that's kind of just what happens as it dries. So what I do, I either take the slab just in my hands, or you can, similar to as you're doing like a pie crust, you can drape it over the rolling pin and put it down. You want to make sure that, see how it's very long on this side and shorter on this side? You want to try to make sure that the center of your slab is over the center of your piece. At least having it long enough to reach down to the end of your slump mold. Alright, so what I'm going to now do, it's kind of just looking like a plate now. If I were not going with this specific style, I would, choose how I wanted it to look, whether I wanted it to be short or if I wanted to leave it like this and just kind of play around with the way that the clay folds, kind of like this. But I have a specific mold in mind that I'm doing, so I'm going to make sure that they end up like that. So what I'm going to do is, starting from the top here, you see where the bowl underneath is, I'm going to push down, and so this is where having something that spins comes in handy. If I wasn't doing it on something that spins freely, what I could do is have it on my bat and just kind of turn my bat as I do it, and that would work fine as well. But so using this part of my hand to just gently push it down. You want to do little bit, so that you're not pushing it all the way down here, because then you'll end up stretching the clay out and you can end up with it kind of folding in a way that doesn't look too good. And so just do it little by little around the bowl. And so sometimes it will get stuck to the surface down here. It's kind of stuck over here. What I want to do is lift it up so that as I'm shaping it onto the bowl underneath it, I'm not stretching the clay to be in its shape. I want it to stay the same thickness that it is, so I kind of lift up the edges as well as I go, just to make sure that I'm not stretching it, like I just said. So just go around and around. And so you see, it's like, it folds a little bit here. If I were to push that in, you'll see that it kind of it'll sometimes kind of fold more tightly. Obviously this I'm going to be cutting off, so that's not a problem. But if you were to be doing that from the beginning, from up here, it could affect the laying smoothly of the rest of the bowl. And so you just keep doing it until you get down to the bottom. And what you can also do is use your sponge. You want to squeeze it out. You don't want to use a soaking wet sponge. So I'll typically squeeze my sponge out all the way and then just dip a little bit of it in so that it's a little wet, but it's not soaking wet throughout the whole thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this to push into the little lip of the bowl where it goes on the top. Right now it's on the bottom because it's upside down. But I find that the sponge does this better because it squishes, where your hand would maybe squish the clay and have it not go so smoothly into that little crevice of the lip of the bowl. So just, you can kind of touch it to the bowl, tap it. Then after I do that, I'll push down as sorry, my dog is ringing his little bell to go outside. I'll just spin this. And then it's pretty much in the shape of the bowl, you see. Now, what I will do is I will take these little edges and I will kind of compress the clay inward a little bit, just to make sure that there aren't any spots that it's not touching the bowl on the very edge. So you'll see as I go, I push it in, not too hard, just gently, just little bits. All right, and so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a tool, either your fettling knife or this tool that you have, and I'm going to cut off the excess clay. And so what I've kind of been doing when I've been making these bowls, this surface that I'm doing it on has these symmetrical circles, divots, like indentation around, and so I have been kind of using those as a guide for my tool. But so first I'll want to kind of make sure that it's centered, and then I will find where that little divot is underneath, and I'll just cut around. And now my bowl, I'm not going to end up leaving all of that extra clay that's still out from the bowl. You'll see in just a second. So right now the bowl ends about here, but I have this extra clay. What I use this extra clay for is holding the bowl in place so that when I'm spinning this, or if you're spinning your bat, it doesn't slide off, and so it stays kind of more in one spot. Again, if you are not, so like I said, I'm going for this shape, so it doesn't have a big lip hanging over the side, kind of like a hat has a rim. If I wanted it to have that, I would leave that. But what I'm doing here doesn't need this, and so what I'm going to do is just kind of smush my finger down a little bit in like 4 spots, just to hold it in place a little bit better, so that it anchors it down and it sticks to the surface. And there we go. So now you can make a foot in many different ways. I'm just showing you the way I'm making the foot for this. I've done it for a platter where I've just used 4 equally sized little balls, and it was a rectangular tray, and so in the bottom of the four corners I put that little ball of clay, and that was the foot. You don't need a foot. I like to have the foot because it gives the bowl a little bit more stability. When it dries, it often becomes a little wonky, and so I find that when it has a foot, it helps it stay flat, and even if, so this one is probably a little, yeah, it's got a little warp to it. What I can then do is smooth it down by using like sandpaper or something, or even just my rib tool in the area where it's a little higher, and it's super easy to just flatten it out so that it doesn't rock. Where if you have a flat bottom, instead of having the lip, if it gets wonky, it can be very hard to get it to be flat again so that it doesn't rock. So I tend to put little feet. If you do 3 feet on something, so like 1, 2, 3, it won't have that rockiness to it, where if you've ever had a table with 4 legs and one of them is a little shorter than the others, it will cause the table to have a little rock in it. And same way with the bowls or trays, if it has 4 feet on it, it will get, it can sometimes have that little rock to it. So if you're not, as long as you're not doing a square bowl or something, I would recommend 3 feet or just 1 continuous foot. So I've got my piece. I'm going to start it off by making a coil. And so it might have some like little cracks in it, but that's not an issue. That you can smooth out with your serrated rib tool and then wet with your sponge. So you want to just figure out how big you want the foot to be. I've been doing the same size coil pretty much for every bowl that I've been doing over here so that they have a more uniform look. But so that's something that you want to decide as you're rolling your coil out if you're doing the foot. And so I've got it to be about the diameter that I want it, and so now I'll cut it, because the edges are a little thicker because I know I'm not going to be using all of that clay. So I cut it large, and then I take it, put it on here, and then I see, okay, I only need it to be about there. I can cut this last like 2 inches off, and so I do that. Now what I do to make sure that the edges of the coil stay attached better is I cut at an angle. So here, I'll show you. So you see there's an angle there. I'm going to cut it the opposite way here so that they kind of fit together like a puzzle piece. And so now I've got the 2 pieces there that will fit. And the purpose of this is so that when you're scoring and slipping and attaching 2 pieces, it often is weaker than the bond that the rest of the clay has. So if it is going to break, most likely it will break at the part where you've joined the pieces together. And this is the same for if you're making a coil pot as well. What I do for this is I attach it at an angle because it gives it a greater surface area, as opposed to just those little diameters, just sticking it together. Having it have a little bit more surface area helps it connect and helps it stay together. So I'm going to score and slip the 2 sides. And I don't really use my sponge for this. I'll just dip my finger in so that it has like a little drip on my finger, and I touch it to the end. And I'm good. And then I smush the clay together here, sliding it back and forth, wiggling them till I feel a little bit of pull, or resistance, I should say. And then I stop doing that because I don't want them to fall apart. And so then I will smooth the 2 ends of the coil together. So I'm going to score and slip the bottom of the pot. And I'm also going to score and slip the coil. And so again, I want to make sure that it's centered on the bowl so that it's not off to the side. And then I'm going to use my fingers to push down on the coil so that it has a nice hold on the bottom of the pot. As you do this, it might get a little misshapen, and that's okay. You can just like push it in a little bit while it's still wet and it's not completely intact and connected. Once it has a strong bond with the clay, it'll be harder to move it. So as you push it down, you want to make sure that you're also adjusting the shape of it. What I can also do is use this tool or any flat tool that you have and just push it down as well. It'll help it even more. And so now you can leave it like this, or you can trim up the bottom and the sides of it. What I've been doing is I've been squishing this part down, and so I'm going to do that again so that it looks the same as my other bowls. So I'm using this tool that's kind of curved like that to push down the inside part of the coil. It won't end up looking like this kind of, I'll smooth it out and I'll show you how to do that. And try to make sure that you don't trap any air inside of it. Don't just push it straight down. What I'm kind of doing is pushing down, starting at the tip of it, so that it pushes the clay down kind of in this motion, so that it doesn't trap air inside. And I go around a couple times. And I smooth it inward as well, so that there's not that little lip on the inside of the coil. And there we go. And then again, it kind of got a little bit off shape, so I'm just going to use my fingers to push it back into shape. All right, and what I'm going to do now is use my sponge to smooth all of this out. You see there's some cracks over here, and I'll show you how to fix that again later. And you can use your tools to clean up the edges, because sometimes you'll be able to see where you scored and slipped it. And so I like to just touch it up with this tool because it's nice and pointed, but it's not too sharp. If you use this tool, you might end up, cutting the clay where you don't want it. So this just is a lot more gentle than the knife. And then to fill in those cracks, take a little piece of clay and I wet it a lot. I'll even take the sponge and just set it on the sponge so it stays moist. Like super, super wet, like kind of between the consistency of slip and clay. So you want to just smooth it over the cracks, and those little chunks of clay will get into the little cracks and it will be all good. And now to flatten the bottom of the foot, I will use this to make sure that it's at the right angle that I want the foot to be at. And so again, using the spinning surface makes this part a lot easier. You can do it by just, you know, moving it around the foot with the bowl being still. But in my opinion, it makes it easier. But if you don't have one that spins, it's not the end of the world. And so as I do this, I will wet the clay a little bit just so that it's easier to scratch off. Because I don't want it to be such a rounded foot. The way I've been doing the other bowls is it's kind of a little bit more on the flat side. So you'll see it's got this part that's very flat. Obviously this part is rounded, as you can see, but the actual part that will be touching the table or whatever surface it's on is going to be flat. And then to clean this part that's kind of more rounded, that's on the inside, I'll use this tool because it has this nice little rounded edge. And so what I'll do when I'm using a tool like this that's wooden to smooth out the bottom, I'll typically wet the surface of it just so it doesn't stick to the clay. It's easier for it to slide along. And now what I'm going to be doing is cutting off the extra clay that is around the outside of the bowl here. So what I do is I use this tool because it's nice and sharp and it's thin. And I start kind of farther out than I think the lip of the actual mold is. And I will come in until, okay, that's, I know, as far inward as I can go because that's the edge of the bowl. So it's best to start farther out rather than accidentally cutting in too close and cutting the clay up on the mold. And so with the saran wrap, sometimes you'll have to be careful. Sometimes the tip of this knife will get caught on the saran wrap. I mean, it's not the end of the world. It's just saran wrap, but it can sometimes make the knife get caught. Sometimes you're able to pull through and just, you know, cut the saran wrap as well. But sometimes you'll want to kind of lift up the knife just a tiny bit and then set it back down right about where you had lifted it up from. And then just keep cutting. And then I'll peel it off. And there you go. Now I want to leave it to dry a little bit on the mold before I go to take it out. I'll show you how to take it out when it's dried a little bit more. But yeah, that's basically most of the work that you'll be doing. If you want, which I always do, I will clean up the edge of the bowl so it's not such a jagged lip. And it's not such a sharp lip, because if you were to take this out, you'll see it's a very pointy edge. So like you can, oh, careful, don't do that. What you can also see, there's some little jagged parts, like right over there, from just a little, probably a bump in the saran wrap. And then as I pulled the knife around, it caught the saran wrap and pulled it, so it kind of just opened up a little crack. But that's okay. What I've been doing is taking off the top, like, you know, 1/16 of an inch with a sponge, so that it's smooth and rounded, and also it takes out all of those little imperfections. By rubbing the sponge on it, it kind of acts almost like sandpaper. When the clay is still a little more wet, it's not quite this dry yet, but a little bit drier than this. There are different stages where the clay is drying. When it's in this stage, clay as it dries is in different stages. So when it's in this stage where it's completely pliable and like the way that it is when you get it out of the bag of clay, that's known as plastic. And then as it dries, it is called leather hard. And we're not quite to that point in this yet. I would say this is leather hard, this little scrap that I had peeled off earlier, where when you use your fingernail, you can still make quite an easy, it's easy to make a dent with your nail, but it's not really pliable. This is kind of a little more moist than actual leather hard, but that's typically, the leather hard is what you want the clay to be at when you're, you know, doing anything on the surface of it, or if you're making, say, a lantern where you carve parts of it away. It's when it has quite a bit of stability, where this, if I were to drop it on the floor right now, it would smush, and with this, when it's bone dry, it would shatter because it doesn't have any of the water in it really, and it hasn't been put in the kiln yet, so it's very fragile. But yeah, so I typically will let this sit for a while until it gets about leather hard, and then I'll flip it and take the bowl out and then peel the saran wrap off of the inside of the bowl. So right now we're not quite there yet, so we're going to wait a little while, and then I will show you that step next. Once it's leather hard, so it's just a little bit more dry than it was before, I will take out the mold from the inside. So this just lifts out super easily, and then the saran wrap just peels out. And so if the clay is too wet, pulling this out can sometimes warp the shape of the bowl, but it didn't happen now because my clay is dried just enough. And now if I were to do this without the saran wrap, it would be virtually impossible to take this out, because the clay, the moisture of it will stick to the bowl, and you'll have to let it dry almost completely in order to take this out. And then at that time, because it's drying and there's still the bowl on the inside, it can sometimes crack either the edge or the bottom, because as it dries, it shrinks just a little bit, and having the bowl there won't allow it to shrink all the way. All right, so then I'm going to take my sponge just to clean off the top edge. And now you can use your sponge to do this, or a tool if you want. I find that the sponge is kind of just, it does it slowly, so it doesn't cut into the clay, and so it's nice to use the sponge. Just do it a little bit at a time. Obviously, it depends on how much you're trying to take off. Now, if I wanted to make this flat, I would, suggest using the knife. But since I'm just looking to round out the pointy edges of the bowl, I'm just going to use my sponge. And so at this time, I can also use my knife to make sure that it's a little bit more rounded. There are a couple spots here where it's not completely symmetrical, where when I was cutting it, I cut it a little bit farther out from the bowl, and that you can fix by just using the side of your knife to kind of scrape it away. You see, I'm just scraping a little bit away at a time. And yeah, and once you get the top of the bowl to how you're wanting it to look, I would suggest taking your sponge, again, slightly wet, not soaking wet, but use the sponge to smooth out any of those little wrinkles from the saran wrap that have left an impression on the clay. Use this to smooth it out. There's sometimes so in the bowls that I've already made, there's some little wrinkles that I just didn't get out entirely, and that's okay. They're not so deep, so once you put glaze over it, you shouldn't really be able to see it. It won't create that much texture. And if for some reason you need your clay to dry a little quicker while you're trying to work on it, if you're trying to do something and you need it to be just a tiny bit drier, I would suggest using a hair dryer and just blowing it on there. Keep the bowl moving a little bit. You don't want to dry one spot too much. Now, the hair drying technique is not meant to dry the entire clay body of the pot. It will just kind of dry the surface of the clay, so don't overuse the hair dryer if you decide to use that. And so I'm actually going to put this back in here, because there are a few spots on my bowl that are just a little bit more sticking out than I want. So I'm going to put this back in here and just cut along with it. Use it as a guide, kind of. And even right now, my clay is a little bit too wet, so as I'm working on it, I just noticed that it's kind of pushing the wall of the bowl outward. So, if you start working on it and you realize that, it's always okay to stop and just pick it back up in a little while. If you're in the middle of working on something, and you need to step away, if you need to go to work or go to sleep or whatever, make sure that you cover the bowl or whatever it is that you're working on with a plastic bag and have it tight around the bottom of your bat so that it stays moist. If you don't do that, if you just leave it out, the clay will dry, and if you still have to do things on it, it will be too dry to be able to do anything. So just keep that in mind when you walk away from your clay. Take a notice of how dry the clay is already, and if you need it to be still soft enough to work on, make sure that you don't leave it out in the air.
You ordered food?
Yeah,
What?
yeah.
What'd you get?
A bowl.
What?
A bowl.
You got food time?
Yeah. And so if you watched the last video of the pinch pot, you saw that you kind of push the clay together little by little to collar it as you go up. You can do that same thing with a slab rolled piece of clay as well. It's a little bit more difficult to actually get it to compress, but even just pushing it a little bit inward can make a difference.
You pause it.
No, I'm only having certain parts of it where you can hear.
Can you crack my back, please?
In a minute. My camera's gonna